Hello everyone, Professor Kozluk here. I just wanted to give a brief update about the Russia-Ukraine war. I know it's been a couple of days since we talked about it, and since we talked about it, there have been a milestone hit for the Russian casualties in the war. So before we get to that, I just kind of wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about the updates on the war. So when we think about an end to the conflict, we haven't really been hearing much about the peace negotiations. We had a prisoner exchange, and we've seen a couple of these over the past couple of months, where Russia and Ukraine engage in a prisoner exchange. So that's positive because we see stories in Ukraine about people who have been captured for 2.5 years now, getting to return home. So prisoner exchanges, of course, are good for those involved. But beyond that, we haven't really seen any progress on an end to the hostilities. So when we think about how many people are still in the conflict, hundreds of thousands of Russian and Ukrainian soldiers. So many soldiers are still in the conflict. We see the type of warfare, the emergence of drone warfare. We've seen Washington Post articles talking about how the Russia-Ukraine conflict is actually changing the nature of warfare. The Council on Foreign Relations had a piece on it, are we forever changing war? So that is an interesting thing to think about, that people in these fields are thinking about, is this really changing the form of war going forward? Will we see more drone warfare? And when we talked about the Ukrainian strikes deep inside Russia, it also raises the question of how governments will be able to defend against some of these strikes. So we still see hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides in the conflict. We see this changing nature of conflict. And when we think about territorial gain, the Russians are gaining Ukrainian territory, but very slowly. The territorial expansion is extremely slow. But the Russians are still capturing Ukrainian territory, just at a pretty low rate. Today, the Russians control about 20% of Ukrainian territory, but really only are advancing between 50 and 130 kilometers per day. So a slow, pretty deadly advance across the Ukrainian countryside. So the takeaway there is that the Russians are still controlling territory, but a very high cost. In fact, a Newsweek report came out yesterday saying that Russian casualties have now surpassed 1 million people. This is killed, wounded, missing in battle. A pretty dreary number for the Russian military. Over 1 million people are considered casualties. And these numbers come from the Ukrainian government, so they might be exaggerated a bit or miscounted a bit, but these are numbers that you will see talked about in Western media. The AP News, the Washington Post ran articles with this number. Again, the Newsweek article, which is where I'm getting this information from, said that the Russian casualties have now surpassed 1 million people, which is a pretty dreary milestone for Russian society. Ukrainian losses aren't as high, but still pretty high, between 45 to 70,000 people killed in battle. You can find various numbers, different media sources report different numbers, but still between 45 to 70 expected killed on the Ukrainian side. So still a much smaller population in Ukraine, a pretty frightful number of Ukrainian service personnel have been killed. When we look at the daily casualty rates on the Russian side, it's about 1,200 a day. So a gigantic number of Russian soldiers killed, injured, missing in battle. And so you will encounter discussions about how the Russians continue to resupply their army, their military. Part of it is with new recruitment programs offering really years worth of salaries to soldiers if they sign up for the military. Depending on where you live in Russia, depends on how much of a signing bonus you get. But what we are seeing is a ton of volunteers from remote parts of Russia where the economic situation hasn't been great since the collapse of the Soviet Union in many of these far off regions of Russia. So we see soldiers signing up from those regions, and then we see the casualty rate in battle is high. So there have been talks about would Russia use a second conscription. We haven't seen a lot of serious talks about that and serious analysis saying that Putin would do that again. The first conscription that Putin used faced a lot of societal backlash. And although Russia's an authoritarian regime where protests don't have that same capacity to shape public policy as they do in a democracy, Putin's still undoubtedly concerned about civil strife and civil unrest. So we don't know how this conflict will end. We do know, though, that the Russians are slowly capturing more territory and that the Russian casualty rate is extremely high. So I just wanted to do a quick update here about the Russia-Ukraine conflict with the milestone of the Russian casualty rate surpassing 1 million. Okay, thank you.